Hey folks, we're going to talk a little bit about Transcendentalism. There is no test involved with this video, but just so that you have some information because you're going to need it for your projects, I wanted to give you some. So the Transcendental Movement started about 1836. It was a reaction to rationalism, started by our good friends Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Lots of people belong to the Transcendental Club. Folks like Bronson Alcott, who's the father of Louisa May Alcott, William Ellery Channing, who was a good friend of Thoreau's, Margaret Fuller, and they're a group of intellectuals that sat around talking, sort of like a ginormous nerdy book club. But what kind of marks them as slightly different is that they all had this religious belief that our nature, that religion, you don't need an intermediary. You don't need a priest or a pastor. Religion is within you, and the divine is in nature. So they were very progressive. They were feminists. They were anti-slavery. They believed in communal living. And they believed that you yourself were God, and you could interpret using your own intuition. You could figure out the truth, and that the truth lies within you. And so within each person is the oversoul, and God is within you. And they bucked things like materialism and mass forms of religion. They believed that truth came through your intuition, that you could trust yourself, and that you should work against fighting the quote-unquote common sense. What people say is, well, that's just the way it is because that's the way it is, and that you should rely on your own intuition. Your inner voice, which we talked about with Emerson, and self-reliance, and all the things that we talked about with Thoreau and Emerson when we spoke about the two of them. They had a journal called the Dial. They would write essays, and they would write poetry and things like that to submit to the Dial that sort of pushed this independence, individuality theme, right? So Nathaniel Hawthorne was a Transcendentalist. We're going to read some of Margaret Fuller's work, and even Walt Whitman identified himself. And remember, when we talk about the pendulum swinging, he's swinging at the other end because he's right after him. War breaks out with the Civil War. And then we see the realist movement come back. But he identified as a Transcendentalist also because he wrote a lot about nature. Leaves of Grass is all about nature. And trusting in the nature of our inner nature and our inner truth. So just know, what's important to know is that even though Emerson was a minister, he was a Unitarian minister, his father and grandfather were too, and even though these are all spiritual people, they believe that God resided in the self, and that you didn't need a priest or a pastor to tell you what to believe about God. You could go to nature and find God, and that's where God was or is. So keep that in mind. And I found this really great article about Transcendentalism on Christianity.com. Well, I'm not going to make you read it, but you can read it if you want to. But some of the beliefs that I thought were interesting, and they kind of lay it out pretty nicely. They believed that everybody was good, and that original sin was not a thing, and we were all good. Truth can be discovered through personal experience. So your experience and my experience and the next person's experience are all different. All of the Transcendentalists were politically active. They all opposed slavery. They were, and you have to think about this as the 1830s, right? So we don't go to war for another 20 years. So there's a whole lot of people in the South who have slaves and a whole lot of people up north who think they shouldn't, right? So things are getting more tense. They also were very progressive about women's rights and feminism. So Emerson had a school with his brother for girls, because girls were not typically trained at the same level that boys were. And so they started to go for a school for girls, but Emerson didn't really care for teaching. But a lot of Bronson Alcott had a school for girls, and he had all daughters. So, he made sure that they were literate. And, of course, Louisa May Alcott became a prolific and a famous writer of Little Women. They were really they really cared about the environment in which we lived and innovation in education, better conditions for workers. And this is at a time when people weren't thinking about that, right? We're getting ready. We're on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. We're almost there yet. So, they're coming at that before, before mass factories. And so then when we see like Hawthorne's daughter going to serve the poor in the tenements, she's then dealing with the aftermaths or the effects of the Industrial Revolution. So they had, they had their dial. They talked about going into nature and becoming connected to nature. This article talks about whether or not it's biblical, or whether or not they are Christians or not. So I will let you read all that on your own. But it's interesting that it's there are other movements that are often either considered philosophical or religious, and modern Druidry has that same sort of approach. Some people consider themselves philosophical Druids, while other people consider themselves religious Druids. Same with Wicca. There are people who are religious Wiccans and people who are sort of philosophically Wiccan. But that can also be said true about the major religions, right? There are people who are culturally Jewish, and then people who are religiously and culturally Jewish, are people who are religiously Catholic, or people who are culturally Catholic. So it's definitely a movement to look into if you're interested in nature and sort of the God within. And that's what Transcendentalism is all about.